We are also going to look at how emotional intelligence and conflict resolution or conflict engagement are interconnected, and what skill sets from those areas you can use to handle difficult conversations. All right, so we'll start with emotional intelligence, then we'll get into conflict engagement, and then we'll start talking about specific skills. So generally speaking, what is emotional intelligence? So this would be in the area of psychology. It's really talking about a wide range of emotional skills that you can use that affect the way you think and the way you act, okay? Or more simply, making emotions work for you as opposed to against you. And just like intelligence, general intelligence, this is measurable, right? So we can actually come up with a score for emotional intelligence. We would call that your emotional intelligence quotient. Just like your IQ, you have your EQ. But when we talk about emotional skills, that is pretty broad. There's a broad range there. So let's take a look at what that would include. All right, so I like to think about emotional intelligence as basically a grid with kind of two spectrums that we need to think about. So whose emotions are we dealing with, and what are we doing with those emotions? So are we dealing with the self, our own emotions, or others' emotions? And then are we just trying to identify and know the emotions, or are we trying to manage and control the emotions? So depending on which part of the grid you're talking about, we're going to be doing different things. So let's go through them kind of one by one here. So first would be looking at the self. If you're trying to know your own emotions, we're talking about self-awareness. Some things are obvious, right? Being able to identify and label your emotion would certainly fall in this area. There's also other pieces, like, can you identify what caused your emotion to occur? Can you identify what that emotion is affecting down the road? Like, is it controlling or affecting your thinking and your behaviors? Is it hindering your ability to reach a goal? Okay. And even just the simple process of labeling an emotion is not that simple, because there's a lot of emotions. We'll come back to this slide. So if you're not done with this one, that's okay. We're going to come back. See if I can get it to come up. Okay, so this is the feeling wheel. This was created by Dr. Gloria Wilcox. And Dr. Wilcox says, when we try to label our emotions, we tend to think of a really simple emotion. So that would be really the center of the wheel, okay? So we're talking about, if someone says, what are you feeling? We say, I feel sad, I feel mad, I feel happy. And Dr. Wilcox says this is very imprecise language. What we should try to do is look at radiating outward on the wheel to be more precise with our language. So instead of identifying I'm angry, well, what type of angry? Because angry jealous is a lot different than angry betrayed. And angry betrayed is a lot different than angry withdrawn, right? So we should try to be a little bit more specific with our language, and we can use something like the feeling wheel to help us do that. Okay, I'm going to take us back to where we were before. Okay.
This screen's just a little
bit slower.
Yeah.
That's why. So if you don't know what I'm doing, I can see my slides over here, so I don't have to turn around all the time. But this one's delayed. So if you're like, what is she doing? That's what I'm doing. Maybe I'll just keep looking back here. All right, so let's go through the other boxes now. So we know what identifying our emotions is. What about controlling them, right? And it's difficult to control our emotions if we haven't identified them. So these boxes are interconnected as well. But controlling emotions would be things like, can you handle your emotion in a appropriate way that's adaptive considering your environment, right? Sometimes it's appropriate to get super excited and be very exuberant and demonstrative with our excitement. Other times that's totally misplaced, okay? Other pieces that this includes, self-motivation, which is something we don't often think about. Like, let's say you're trying to study for an exam. Can you engage in frustration tolerance when you're having trouble understanding the material? Can you push through and persevere? Do you get distracted? Do you have trouble inhibiting your impulses? Instead, just give in and binge Netflix instead of studying, right? All of those pieces fit into controlling your emotions. Can you handle stress? Okay. Okay, so we have a question here. Should we be trying to control our emotions, or should we be focusing on managing them? Regulation versus control. Leo, do you want to say a little bit more about what you think, what you consider the distinction there to be? And you can feel free to unmute, or you can keep typing. That's fine.
Sure. I guess, I mean, I'm someone who does cognitive behavioral therapy as practice, and mindfulness is a practice.
Yes.
And mindfulness is about accepting what's going on, the emotions, and then letting them go and not controlling them. So it's about acceptance and acknowledgement, which is a way that we can manage having these emotions rather than trying to put a stop to anger or trying to manipulate ourselves into being happy. So, for example.
Yeah, I think I see what you're saying. We're actually going to talk about mindfulness a bit later today, so I'm really happy to hear you bring that up. And I am a huge fan of mindfulness. I have to actually kind of reel myself in when we talk about that because I only have a few minutes to talk about it. But yeah, I tend to go on the side of looking at more of like managing and regulation, and I really like the idea of acceptance. I think trying to like trick yourself out of an emotion is typically unsuccessful. So for example, research on like thought suppression, saying things like, don't be angry, don't be angry, don't be angry. That's not effective. That doesn't work, right? So when I'm talking about kind of controlling one's emotions, we want to do it in an adaptive way that's going to be helpful for us, right? I hope that helps. Okay. Other squares that we have. So let's look at others. So others, if we're trying to know someone else's emotion, we're obviously going to be trying to identify or label the emotion, but this also includes things like listening and empathy and sympathy. So difference there would be sympathy is feeling bad for somebody. I'm so sorry that happened to you. And then empathy would be really understanding and feeling with somebody. Like you're sad, so I'm sad. I'm right there feeling it with you, okay? And then lastly, managing relationships is multifaceted. So we have things like empathy and sympathy can motivate you to engage in pro-social or altruistic behaviors, okay? And if you feel motivated to help somebody, do you know what to do to help them in a way that's going to be effective? Other things about managing relationships, I mean, pretty much anything, right? Can you ask for something in an assertive, effective way? Can you negotiate with somebody? Can you manage a group? Can you lead? Can you read social cues or understand when somebody is using their EQ to manipulate you? Okay. So there's a lot of components here that become relevant. All right. So we got the feeling wheel. Okay. So now we're moving forward. We're going to look at an example. Okay. So this is just a fictional example, but might resonate with some of you. So think about our squares and see if you can apply them to this example, okay? So we have Kay is having an argument with their boyfriend Amir. Amir is insisting that they attend a large family wedding for Amir's sister. Kay does not want to go because of the pandemic. Most of the attendees will not be wearing a mask at this indoor event. At this point, the argument has turned into a shouting match. Amir, teary-eyed, has just yelled, "You don't care about my family. If you don't care about my family, you don't care about me." Kay has just responded by yelling back, "What are you talking about? That's not what this is about. It's like you aren't even listening." So let's try to take Kay's perspective here. And can you figure out how Kay could show the 4 elements of emotional intelligence? Okay, so first let's think about self-awareness of one's own emotions. So feel free again to unmute yourselves, just chime in. What would be an example of self-awareness of one's own emotions? Take a minute to think. Just go ahead and chime in when you're ready. So someone in chat, Elliot says, identifying the emotion and why they feel that way. Yeah, I think so. Can we take any educated guesses what Kay might be feeling here?
I was going to say, can Kay just acknowledge the fact that she feels a little nervous about attending the wedding and maybe even some anxiety about attending the wedding?
Yeah, I think you're really using your recognizing emotions of others there and recognizing that Kay in this situation, if you were Kay, you would be feeling kind of anxious and fearful here. Yeah.
She's also using language that indicates she doesn't feel heard.
They are, yeah. At the end there, the what are you even talking about? You aren't even listening. Okay. Elliot says that Kay feels vulnerable, exposing themselves in a gathering like that. Yeah, so vulnerability. Absolutely. What could Kay do to control their emotions? It's okay if you're just kind of taking some guesses here, but you've already heard a bit about what that might entail.
Whenever I've ended up in a shouting match with someone, the best thing for me to do to regulate my emotions is to step away from it temporarily, to calm myself down and then return to the conversation later. And sometimes that involves negotiating with the person to say, hey, you know, we've gotten to this point, it's become toxic. Let's just take a little break, cool down, and then come back when we're more collected.
Yeah, and I think what you're acknowledging there is something that involves both of the first 2 pieces. There's a sense of self-awareness of my emotions are blocking me from reaching my goal at this time and are having a negative effect on my thoughts and actions. And that's leading to this approach to control one's emotions by saying, let's step away and take a breather. Yeah. What about recognizing emotions in others? So,
Oh, I was going to say, can Kay realize that Amir is feeling some emotions as well? And maybe she feels like he's not listening to her, but he's trying to he's expressing some feelings as well because his family is important to him, and he may not be as able to say it the way that Kay is saying it as far as like not listening, but he thinks that she doesn't care about his family. So can she acknowledge the fact that she does care about his family, and that, you know what I mean, like realize that he has some feelings and some emotions involved here as well?
sure. So Amir might be feeling maybe a bit like abandoned or betrayed here, right? If we wanted to put some specific words on that, absolutely. So kind of recognizing that, stepping into that person's shoes can help us identify the emotion that they're experiencing. What about managing relationships? This one's probably the hardest. We'll be practicing this one a lot today.
Yeah. Would she suggest, when things have gotten better with the pandemic, that she's excited to visit his family? And that way he's able to see that she does care about his family. It's just about the pandemic right now.
Sure. So doing some clarification of what's really the root of the feelings there. Yeah. Other ideas, thoughts? Okay, and hopefully this last one will become a little bit clearer for you as we kind of get through the presentation today. You'll see some more examples. Todd says Kay could stay quiet and stare at their ring finger. So yeah, we have that would definitely have an effect on the relationship, right? Okay. All right, let's I know we're a little short on time. Like we could go on and on about this example, but let's move forward. So last thing I want to say about emotional intelligence before we start talking about conflict engagement is emotional intelligence is really important. So it really kind of affects all facets of your lives. Even for children, we find that they do better in school. They get along better with their peers. They tend to have fewer internalizing and externalizing problems. Like they don't act out as much. They don't have as many issues with anxiety and depression. It makes us more productive and effective with our actions. So if you've heard the term,
that gentleman came back.
say that once more.
I'm sorry, I meant to be muted.
Oh no, okay, no problem. So if you've ever heard the term, I can't think straight, a lot of times when we say that, we mean that an emotion has kind of like hijacked our brain, right? That our working memory is suffering because of our emotions. Working memory is very limited in its capacity. It's your ability to kind of think about something actively and be handling that information in your mind in the moment. If there's an emotion that's kind of taken over, it makes it hard to have the space to think about the other information because that emotion is so prevalent. That's what you're thinking about. So having good EQ skills helps you kind of manage that emotion so that you can get back to using your working memory where you want it, okay? It also is linked to fewer effects from stress. So we know stress has an enormous negative effect on our physical and mental well-being. And it's also linked to higher life satisfaction. People are just more satisfied and happier when they have better emotional intelligence skills. And the nice thing about EQ is it's changeable. You can practice it and you can get better and get a better, higher like score basically on emotional intelligence, okay? Other questions, comments before we move on?
I just want to say one thing, Jess.
Yeah.
One of the things that just highlights the importance of emotional intelligence is like a lot of school K through 12 schools throughout the United States are really in the last 10 years have really emphasized emotional intelligence. Here in Cleveland, at the Cleveland Metropolitan School District, the Cleveland-wide school district, they have in each school they have a social emotional like individual that helps with working with students and youth to develop these emotional intelligent skills and increasing their intelligence in this regard. So I think that's just important to recognize that there's a lot of concrete research out there that points that it's better for people's well-being as well as their ability to communicate, work through conflict, which we're going to talk about in a second, and to your point, it's something that we can develop if we intentionally work on it.
Right.
Yeah. Can I ask one question?
Yeah.
So I know you're trying to move, but one thing I was thinking of is, well, the focus of this series is on racial justice. We also have a number of initiatives related to gender. And I was just wondering if you could comment quickly on the gendered aspect of especially teaching emotional intelligence. And if there's some sort of conversation that really needs to focus on men being taught emotional intelligence. I don't want to derail the whole conversation, but even if you can just point us towards something else to look at maybe.
Yeah, I mean, the concern there, I mean, obviously if we're starting at a very young age, like we go in elementary school and start training kids in emotional intelligence, it helps eliminate some of those issues. But as boys age, they do get a lot of messages about not expressing emotion, right? And that's kind of getting back to where we were talking before about just trying to control or bury your emotion, and how that's not a super effective way if you're not actually effectively managing it. So yeah, there needs to be a different push, and we're seeing more things coming out, especially with like men's mental health. But there's a lot of really, so a lot of biases out there we have to break down to do that effectively. There's like so many other things to say about that. But
I don't want to open up that entire thing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just to add to that, one recommendation I have, if people are interested in looking more at this question that Matt posed, there's a film called Tough Guys, and actually there's a Tough Guys 2 as well, and it looks at how young boys are socialized, and specifically to repress their emotions, and how unhealthy that is. And it's Tough Guys, it's a play on words, it's G-U-I-S-E instead of G-U-Y-S. So it's on Canopy, for those of you that use Canopy, which has a lot of documentary and educational type films. And as Tri-C students, faculty, and staff, we have free access to it. So awesome. Thanks, Jess. I'll take over. So Jess will be back in just a few minutes. Yep. But hi, everyone. Again, my name is Ty, and I've been working at the college for about 9 years now, specifically with our conflict resolution and peace studies program. I've been involved with a lot of the Stand for Racial Justice work at the college and in the community. And I also teach in conflict and peace studies. And so emotional intelligence and conflict resolution really go hand in hand. And we'll be getting into that throughout my section of the presentation, and then the following kind of like areas that we're going to look at after we frame these two concepts. Before we go too far, I want to give us some context for what conflict is. There's a lot of different ideas around what conflict is, and it's hard. It's one of those things that's oftentimes hard to define, in part because there's many different levels of conflict. We have international conflict, tensions between the United States and Russia, or the U.S. and North Korea, or U.S. and Canada or Mexico, right? But then there's this concept called interpersonal conflict, and that's what we're going to be looking at today, the conflicts that occur between individuals. And so before we go too far, I just want to acknowledge that conflict is something that's normal, it's common, it's inevitable, and it's something that most individuals don't enjoy. I mean, think about it for yourself. If I were to ask you, do you enjoy conflict? Most people are going to say no. I was giving a presentation a week ago at Western Campus to a class of about 25 students, and I asked them that question. How many of you enjoy conflict? No one raised their hand. I joke that I enjoy conflict when I'm watching other people in conflict, but I don't like being in conflict myself, right? And I think that's true for most of us. We watch TV all the time, a lot of us do. And what makes good TV? A lot of great conflict, right? But when we find ourselves in conflict, it's uncomfortable. And it brings up a lot of those negative emotions that Jessica referred to earlier. So conflict, a simple definition is conflict is a perception of differences of interests among people. So, and the perception element is key, because sometimes we perceive different agendas, different interests, different values, but more often than not, there's more similarity than difference. And that's one of the things that we look at when we are learning about how to navigate conflict in a more constructive and healthy way, is where can we find similarity and not just focus on the perceived differences or the differences. One other way that I personally frame conflict is conflict occurs when individuals or groups' interests, needs, values, and or identities are threatened, or again, there's the perception that they're being threatened. So whenever an interest of mine is threatened or I perceive it to be threatened, conflict is going to occur. Or if a need of mine, like a basic human need, if we refer to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you've taken a psychology class, you're familiar with that, or Glasser, or some of the other folks that talk about needs theory, as well as our values. If we think about values, those might be related to our political leanings, might be related to our religious or spiritual beliefs or lack thereof, or it might be related to like our own personal like values, like I am a ethical person, I am social justice minded, I am a kind person. If any of those are threatened or we perceive them to be threatened, that's going to create space for conflict. And then finally, and I think this is really timely considering this is a part of the Stand for Racial Justice efforts at the college, is identity. Whenever we feel threatened based on our identity, or we perceive to be threatened based on our identity, that is a form of conflict that oftentimes shows up as discrimination. And so I just want to highlight that. It could be identity related to race, it could be related to gender, it could be related to a variety of other social identity areas. Okay, so conflict, I kind of went through these already, so I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. If the screen catches up with me, but this is a summary of what I just shared. So interests have to do with like transitory desires, wants, or preferences. We have short-term interests, mid-range interests, long-term interests. Paul has heard this a dozen times, if not more, but I always use the example of when I wake up in the morning, one of my first things that I want is a cup of coffee. I want that cup of coffee. It's an interest of mine. If my wife, my partner was to get in my way and say, Ty, you can't have a cup of coffee in the morning, do you think that would cause conflict? Absolutely. She is threatening my interests, right? Seems silly, but it's a really good way of framing it, right? Values, I already talked about. Again, if our values are threatened or we perceive them to be threatened, conflict occurs. Needs, same thing. With needs, we have both physical and psychological needs. We need water, food, shelter. If we don't have those, especially in Cleveland in the winter, which is coming, we are not going to survive, right? If we don't have shelter. And so when those needs, those basic human needs are threatened, then that's going to cause space for conflict to occur. Likewise, we have those psychological needs. We need to feel a sense of meaning and purpose with our lives. We need to have relationships, meaningful relationships, be loved and feel loved. We need to feel safe and secure. If any of those things are threatened or we perceive them to be threatened, that's space for conflict to occur. And then again, I talked about identity a little bit more, so I'm going to skip over that. Actually, let me pause for a second. Anyone have any comments or thoughts that you want to share, either in the chat or unmute yourself before we go on? Okay, feel free as we're going, if you have something you want to say, either write it in the chat or even you can write in the chat, say, hey, Ty, I have something I want to share, or raise your hand on WebEx. So let's see if this is gonna. Okay, so one of the things that I wanted to also touch on just briefly is that the program that I work with, and a lot of people are familiar with the concept of conflict resolution. Conflict resolution is this idea that when we are in conflict with other people, we can resolve that conflict. We can have a conversation and figure out how to fix that problem that is between us, that is the conflict. We can understand what the other person's interests are or what our interests are, and try to come to some agreement where we can work through that conflict and resolve it. Okay, sorry, I'm getting cued to move up closer to the camera. So conflict resolution focuses on working to resolve or solve the conflict or issue that is occurring. I like to think about dealing with conflict a little bit differently. And there's some literature that's finally starting to come out around thinking about conflict differently. And instead of using and assuming that conflict can always be resolved, saying that there's actually a myriad of different ways that we can engage conflict. So I use the term conflict engagement to include conflict resolution, but also to say that there's space for other ways to deal with conflict. And I'm going to highlight just a few of those. One of them is conflict management. Sometimes when we are in conflict, we're not going to be able to resolve it. It might be a values-based conflict or an identity-based conflict that's really too complex to actually come to some resolution around. And so maybe managing it and kind of having some control over it, especially for folks that are maybe in an organization or in a classroom and they have some form of leadership. Conflict management focuses on working to manage and control the conflict so it doesn't get out of hand. And then also really tries to say, what are the ways that we can use this conflict to promote something positive? It doesn't assume that we can always resolve conflict. It says it's okay to sometimes have conflict and have tension, but let's approach it in a positive and meaningful way if we can. A third one, and this is like my personal favorite, but it's really hard to do, is this concept of conflict transformation. For those of you that might be familiar with the language of transformation, transformation implies change, movement towards something different. The definition that I have for conflict transformation here, it focuses on long-term changes in relationships, social systems, and encourages people to look at why the conflict is occurring in the first place, to have some dialogue around that with people that are coming at this conflict or this issue from different perspectives, and really trying to understand the other person's or parties or groups' values, interests, needs, and identity, and how those play into the conflict. Conflict transformation sometimes works towards resolution ultimately, but it also recognizes that conflict is something that can be positive and constructive, and maybe it never actually has to be resolved. Maybe we just sit with it and we continue with it, have a relationship with it and the people that are from different perspectives than ourselves. And then the final one that I'm going to highlight, and there's other ways of framing, other kind of like subcategories of conflict engagement, but these are the four I wanted to focus on, is conflict escalation. People are like, escalation of conflict? Why would you want to escalate conflict? Conflict escalation focuses on bringing attention to injustices and inequities so as to move forward in a just and equitable resolution or transformation. So sometimes when there is something that is, wrong or unjust or unethical or inequitable that's going on in our social system, in our community, in our relationships, attention needs to be brought to that. And that can cause conflict to escalate, to rise up. And there's various ways to do this, and we're not going to get into strategies and tactics around that, other than to say that escalating conflict is not a bad thing always. Sometimes it's important. If you look at social movements over our world history, oftentimes social movements that were moving towards like more socially just and more equitable communities and countries, they oftentimes had to rely on some form of conflict escalation. It might be, a nonviolent social movement or something along those lines that brought attention to injustices. Right now, in our country, we have the Black Lives Matter movement, right? In a lot of ways, Black Lives Matter is escalating this conflict, this social conflict, to bring attention to injustices that are occurring in our country and our world. So I see a few comments, just like paradigm shift makes sense, turns conflict into an opportunity. Yes, I like the reframing of conflict as an opportunity. We talk a lot about that in the program that I'm involved in. And we'll touch on that a little bit today. So I want to touch on a couple more things, and then we're going to move on. One is conflict style. So we as individual human beings have different tendencies in terms of how we respond to conflict. And there are these two researchers, Thomas and Kilman were their last names, that did a lot of research on conflict and how people approach and deal with conflict. And they identified 5 primary conflict styles that we as human beings have. And they said in their research, and other people have continued to validate this, that most individuals have 1 or 2 primary styles that they use when they're dealing with conflict. And so I'm going to show those real quick. So the first one is competing, which I also kind of put in parentheses dominating, because dominating is sort of a subcategory of competing. It has more of a negative connotation than competing. But competing is this notion that you'll do whatever it takes to get what you want or what you need, or get your values recognized, or get your identity recognized and accepted. And so that might include fighting, yelling, negotiating, becoming violent in a negative sense, right? Being manipulative. It also can include advocating and advocacy, really trying to fight for your rights or another person's rights. So competing, one thing I want to say is none of these are necessarily negative or positive. It's all contextual in how you approach these. So, but if you were to think about a competitor, someone that competes, typically like a lawyer pops in mind, right? They're advocating, they're fighting for their client, right? And so competing can be a really effective way or style to respond to conflict. Sometimes it's not that effective though. It depends on the context, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Avoiding is another common approach. So either physically or psychologically distancing yourselves from others, especially when there's tension. And so that can be like, I use this example from about 10 years ago. Before I was working at Tri-C, I worked at a consulting company, and we were on like the 32nd floor of a downtown building, and it was what I called cubicle land. So we had all these cubicles, and you could see all the way across the building. And you could tell when someone was in conflict with another person, or there was some tension between two people, because people would take the long way around to their cubicle to physically avoid passing by someone's cube because they didn't want to deal with it, right? But so that's an example of like physically avoiding. But also we psychologically avoid. We shut down. We don't want to engage. We don't open up. We don't call someone back. We don't text someone back, right? Sometimes avoidance can look like ghosting, right? But sometimes avoiding is important. If you don't have the energy or the time, or you don't feel safe, right? Avoiding can be a really positive and constructive strategy for dealing with conflict. The third one is accommodating. I'm summarizing these, but not offering any feedback or resistance and just going with the flow, letting the other person have their way, acknowledging the other person, even if you don't agree with them. And accommodating is oftentimes neglecting your own needs or recognition of your fears or concerns or your interests or values or identity. It's nodding and saying, yes, I agree, when you really don't agree, right? And accommodating can be okay in some contexts. I give the example of like my partner, Victoria. She has she has some dietary restrictions. And so we can't just go out to pizza every night, which I love pizza. I love cheese and I love gluten. But she can't have dairy and gluten, or she's not supposed to have a lot of it. And so when we go out, we go to restaurants that she can find something that works for her. We don't just go to pizza joints. I'm accommodating her because I care for her, because I have a strong relationship with her, because I love her, right? And so accommodating can be a healthy approach, especially when it's an important relationship. But the flip side, or the shadow side of accommodating, is that if you are overly accommodating people, it can build up resentment, right? You might be giving people the wrong hints or clues. They might think that you believe what they believe when you really don't, right? And so you have to be careful. It depends. Realizing this is taking longer than I thought. I'll go through these last few things quickly. Compromising, probably most people are familiar with the term compromise. It's a simple way of thinking about it is making a deal. I'll do this if you do that. I have a lot of friends with children, like young children, and they compromise with their kids all the time. You can watch TV for 30 minutes if you put away your clothes first, or if you do your homework first. Like, that's a form of a compromise. And then finally, the last one that we'll touch on is problem solving, or what we call collaborating. That's where you're really airing your concerns, listening to the other person's perspective. And there should be another part to this, working together to come up with a solution that is suitable for all parties. Collaborating is a little bit different in the sense that really at the heart of collaborating is engaging in conversation and dialogue and trying to understand what the other person's needs, interests, values, and identities are, and how those are playing a part in the conflict that you're experiencing. But also, they are open and listening and receptive to understanding what your interests, values, identities, and needs are, so that you can really try to find some common ground and make the situation what we call a win-win, that benefits both to the fullest extent possible. Collaborating is great. The downside of collaboration is that it takes a lot of time, and the other person or group has to be willing to listen and has to be willing to engage in a deep and meaningful way. And oftentimes in our society, people aren't willing to do that, either because the topic is too, is touchy and triggering, or because of the nature of your relationship, or the nature of the setting you find yourselves in. There's a lot of different reasons why people don't collaborate, or people don't have the tools and knowledge to understanding the value of collaboration. Yeah, okay, so question, what do you recommend as the best response to conflict, or is it different for every situation? That's a great question. I had a professor who was one of my favorite professors when I was working on my master's degree. He was a former lawyer, and his name was Stan Sitnick. And Stan, I remember someone asked him this exact question when we were doing our mediation class with him. And Stan's response was, sometimes, maybe, it depends. And then he would repeat it. Sometimes, maybe, it depends. It depends on the nature of your relationship. It depends on the power dynamic, which we might get to a little bit if we have time today. Who holds power and how do they hold it in the relationship? It depends on how safe you feel. If you're not feeling safe in a situation, you might respond differently than if you feel safe. It depends on a variety of different things, your histories with one another, and your age
your ages, your cultural background, all those are things that play into helping us understand the best approach to dealing with conflict. So it's like a complex dance, is what I say. There's not one right step, but it takes time to kind of like hone those skills and knowledge around dealing with different conflicts. There are conflict coaches out there that help to coach people through, like if, you know, Mirel, if you were interested in like having a conversation and giving context to a specific conflict, we could talk through different strategies or approaches or what might be the best style. But it really depends. Sometimes maybe it depends. Great question. And if you're really interested in learning some of this stuff, get in touch with me. We have a conflict resolution certificate program here at Tri-C where we go into detail in all of this. So this is, I think, my last slide. So here's another way of thinking about how we how we select, and this might get to your question, how we select the best approach or style to dealing with conflict. So on the left-hand side of your screen, there's an arrow that goes up, and on the bottom of the screen, there's an arrow that goes to the right. So the higher concern you have for your goals, and in this case, your goals include your interests, values, needs, and identity. The higher concern, the higher you go on this chart. Let's see, there should be something popping up. See if that's going to do it. One more. Okay, cool. So if you have high concern for your goals, you might compete. If you have high concern for the other person's goals, meaning their interests, their values, their needs, their identity, you might accommodate. If you have high concern for both your goals and the other person's goals, that's a great opportunity to collaborate. Whereas if you have low concern on both ends, that's a prime opportunity to avoid. And if it's kind of somewhere in the middle, it's an opportunity to compromise. I know this is a really simple chart, but this might get at your question, Mirel, about what is the best response to a conflict. It depends on the nature of the relationship. It depends on a lot of different things. But this might help you kind of in identifying what style is best in that context. Yeah, Matt.
And is this one of the areas where emotional intelligence can come in then?
Absolutely. And that's a good point. Thanks for bringing that up. So your emotional intelligence can help you, understand how do you feel about this? Like, is the conflict or the issue at hand really important to you? What are some of the emotions you're experiencing around it? But then also reading the other person and individual. Does it appear to be important to them? Like, what are some of the feelings that they're experiencing? And that might help point you in the right direction for what conflict style to approach in a given situation. Great question. Okay. I'm going to hand it over to Jess.
Okay. All right, everyone. Now we're going to shove all this information together. So you're going to start seeing a lot of overlap now happening from everything we've been talking about. And it's going to actually be a little bit difficult on some of these slides to even tell if we're talking about specifically which area it's coming from, because it's really coming from both sides. So let's talk about some different skill sets you can use and build up to manage difficult conversations. Okay, so the first we're going to talk about is empathy and perspective taking. I already told you what empathy is, this idea of you are feeling with someone, so you're understanding where they're coming from, and you're really feeling with them. So if they're sad, you're feeling sad, okay? We like empathy. Empathy is really beneficial to have because it helps someone feel validated, right? When you are empathizing with someone, they feel heard, they feel understood, and it automatically lowers their defensiveness when you're in a conflict situation, because they're like, okay, this person at least gets it. They're understanding my values or interests or needs or what's going on. So how can we use empathy when navigating conflict? okay? Because some of us are really skilled with empathy and some of us not so much. So one way to do this is when you're in a difficult conversation, just take a moment to stop and ask, what is this person's emotion? And not just what is their emotion, but when have I felt this way? And what helped me when I felt this way? Because when you're in conflict, a lot of times it's hard to empathize with the person's position, right? Because a lot of times part of the conflict is you don't agree with their position, so it's hard to empathize with it. But I bet you can empathize with their emotion, because I bet if you identify what their emotion is, you have felt that emotion at some point, right? So if you instead focus on the emotion instead of the position, it can help you come back to a place of empathy. But given that, don't assume you have the whole picture. We don't have the whole picture of what's going on with someone. Even though we can try to take someone's perspective, you aren't that person. And we've all had situations when we've been talking to someone and we have felt misunderstood because they don't get all of the nuances and little pieces that are feeding in to why we're feeling what we're feeling or why we're thinking or doing what we're doing. So remembering that you don't have the whole picture and coming from a place of curiosity to learn what that whole picture is can be beneficial. When in doubt, paraphrase. So when you've listened to somebody and you've heard what they said, try to say it back to them. And paraphrasing is great, where you just try to rephrase it. If you can't paraphrase, just go for a straight up reflection and literally repeat back to them what they said word for word. That's okay if you're not feeling capable of a paraphrase. But paraphrasing what someone else has said has lots of benefits. So one piece is it gives the other person room to correct you if you don't have the whole picture, right? If you're not getting it. So it helps eliminate miscommunication. And then if you are getting it and you have given a good paraphrase of what this person is feeling and thinking and why they're doing what they're doing, when we do that, it helps that person feel validated. It immediately helps ease the tension in the room and gives the other person some space now to say, okay, I've been heard. Now I can listen, right? Because this person's hearing me. Okay. Intent versus impact. I really like this one, but this one can be really hard to manage. So when we're in conflict, there's the intent of what's going on and there's the impact that you have. So intent is the effect I intended to have, the outcome I was looking for, and then the impact is what actually happened. What was the actual effect? And these do not always match up, okay? So when we are hurt, a lot of times we're focused on the impact of what that hurt has done to us, right? So I'm feeling hurt. I feel betrayed by what you've done to me. We're focused on the impact. When we are focused on our impact, we tend to assume that the impact matches the intent. So bad impact means this person had bad intentions. And if they had bad intentions, that means they have bad character. Okay, but if you're really perspective taking, you're probably not, you would recognize that their intent probably isn't what the impact was, right? Most people don't have bad intentions. Some people do, I understand that, but most people don't, right? We don't typically go out with the intention to hurt others. So give others that leeway. Ask yourself, what might their intent be? And then there's the flip side of that. When you are on the defense and you've hurt somebody, we tend to focus on our intent. So when the other person says, you hurt me, you had bad impact, we say, oh, but I didn't mean to hurt you. Right? But your good intentions do not fix the bad impact you had. It doesn't fix it. So you need to own your impact. Acknowledge the impact that you had on this person, whether that was your intention or not. Okay. And then one thing I just want to add, and Ty started to touch on this a bit when we were talking about that accommodating conflict style. Don't fall in the empathy trap. So I'm saying, yes, empathy is so wonderful. It's great to be empathic, but don't be so empathic that you are not being held hostage by someone else's emotions, right? We don't want to give up our needs unless you feel like it's appropriate to do so. If we just continue to override our own needs and we don't hold that sacred, then what will end up happening is it starts to build up resentment and leads to burnout. If we just continue to be so empathic that we are never ever getting our own needs met. Okay. Questions, comments about empathy and perspective taking? I know I went through it pretty fast. See lots of positive things in the chat. We are going to talk about active listening, paraphrasing what other people say. Yeah. Okay. Mindfulness, being present. Actually, just for one moment, humor me. Take a second, close your eyes, notice what's going on and describe what's going on in your body to yourself. Just take a moment to be in tune with your body. Can you feel your heart beating? What is your breath doing? Are you holding tension anywhere in your body? Are there any aches and pains? What are your thoughts doing? All right, and come back to the room. I know this was brief, but did anybody notice anything in that moment that you were not aware of a few minutes ago?
I didn't think I was as tense until you said so.
You didn't know you were that tense?
Yeah, I did my job.
Oh, wow. So you could feel it in your jaw. Yeah. Yeah. Anybody else? I see you doing this. Yeah. Some of you may have noticed that your breathing automatically slowed just because I was telling you to be in tune with your body. Yeah. So that what you're doing is mindfulness. Okay. Mindfulness does not have to be this huge formal thing, like a formal breathing exercise or meditation practice where you sit for 20 minutes. Just checking in for those few seconds counts as mindfulness. So anytime you pay attention to the present moment and you do it deliberately and non-judgmentally, that is mindfulness. So you can kind of view it as doing something wholeheartedly. You're not splitting your attention. You're not multitasking. Okay. And, you know, we could do a whole presentation on mindfulness and all of its components and, you know, how to do it effectively. It's hard to talk about it in a couple minutes, but it's really hard to do this when you're in conflict, right? It's hard to be fully present. It's really hard to be non-judgmental. A lot of times we're wanting to be non-judgmental because we're kind of pissed off. So, you know, but judgment blocks compassion. And judgment also leads to automatic reactions because it puts us on the defensive. And so when we are mindful in conflict, it helps to override some of those automatic reactions, because instead what we're doing is we're being very conscious and deliberate about being in the moment, right? So see, when you wash the dishes, know that you're washing the dishes. Yeah, absolutely. You can do anything mindfully, right? So when you are eating, just eat and know that you're eating, okay? So how could we do this while dealing with conflict? Okay, this is tricky, but first just drop in on yourself, okay? When you are in conflict, just ask, what is my mind doing right now, right? Am I actually here? And you can take a second to think about that right now. Are you all exactly here right now with this presentation? Or is part of your attention split? Is part of your mind thinking about that grocery trip you have to go run, or about the homework you have, or another, something that happened half an hour ago, right? It's hard to be fully present, but you can drop in on yourself when you're in conflict and say, am I really here right now? And if I'm not really here, I need to come back to the moment. And the trick is, when you come back to the moment, do it non-judgmentally. You don't want to say, oh, I'm such an idiot, I'm not even present in this conversation right now. We don't want to be judgmental. We just want to gently bring our attention back. Okay. Active listening. I saw somebody mention this one in the chat. Listening with intent and without judgment is so difficult to do when you're in conflict. When we're in conflict, we tend to have this running commentary going on while the other person's talking. And I know this is something I'm guilty of. I'm often constructing my response while the person is talking to me. So I'm typically thinking about exactly what I'm going to say when they stop talking. But if I'm doing that, that means I'm not listening to them wholeheartedly, right? I'm not fully present, because part of me is in my mind thinking about a response, which means I'm probably going to miss some of what they say and not be able to truly empathize and perspective take, because I'm missing things, right? And there's a good chance that they're picking up on the fact that my mind is split and I'm not actively listening as well. And then be aware of the core you and transient weather patterns. So I really like this one. We all have this like center, right? This piece of like who we really are, the piece you kind of hold sacred. And then we have all these other things that happen all the time, these emotions that sweep in, stuff that's going on. And you can almost view those as weather patterns that are temporary. So like if you're angry about something, you can kind of view it as this storm that has come sweeping in. I was saying, you're going to close that for me.
I think that might be why it's not showing up.
There we go. Thank you. So we can kind of think of it as like a storm that's kind of come in, and we want to kind of recognize that that storm is okay. We're not judging it, but it also does not necessarily reflect on our core self. We still have this core self, and just acknowledging these weather patterns can help us get back to that core you, right? Okay, and then of course, practicing mindfulness is always beneficial. So doing it, the more you practice it outside of conflict, the easier it is to do while you're in conflict. So probably my number one suggestion would really be to do this as much as you can, anytime, anywhere, right? When you're walking someplace, when you are washing dishes, when you're showering, anything you want, you can do mindfully. Just stay present, do it non-judgmentally and wholeheartedly. And the more you practice, the easier it will get. Okay.
Thanks, Jess. Yeah, and I am a big proponent of mindfulness too, and it really is something that has helped me over the years. Like I have an off and on mindfulness practice of more than 10 years, and that's really helped me in my conflict engagement and conflict resolution processes and practices. Helps me to stay calm and present when I'm dealing with some really contentious, heated issues. Yeah, Matt.
So I noticed the question up above that, like we're talking about practicing mindfulness. I can't remember the exact phrasing, but it had to do with empathy. And if you're not really understanding somebody's emotion, is it possible to practice empathy as well as practice mindfulness and to strengthen that? Or if you don't understand somebody's emotion, are you just going to remain lost?
Okay, is it can you identify their emotion if you were never in their situation? Yeah. So I think those are two separate things a little bit. So we have identifying their emotion. So I'm saying in that case, typically, emotions are universal. So even if you've never been in their specific situation before, you can often find a way to connect to their emotion. So maybe you've never been in their situation and have felt, you know, disillusioned the way for this specific situation, but you've probably felt disillusionment somewhere else. Or maybe you don't know what it's like to be jealous in their situation, but you have felt jealousy before. So just connecting to that emotion alone helps with empathy. Now, what you're saying with, you know, this other piece with empathy, I would say, you know, even if we don't feel with somebody, we can always fall back on perspective taking. So even if you don't like feel with them, like somebody's feeling sad and you don't feel sad too, again, be non-judgmental. It's okay. You're working on it. So instead, just try to put yourself in their shoes, right? And we've all done that before, like where we try to step into somebody's shoes, even if you're not feeling with them, right? Because perspective taking and empathy are different. The perspective taking alone will help you with the conflict management.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely, I second that. I use this example of just to kind of riff off that for a second. People are familiar with the golden rule, right? Like treat others the way you want to be treated, right? That's actually not very empathetic if you actually think about the way it's framed, right? Treat others the way you want to be treated. I like to use the example of like, I have a good friend that loves ice cream cake, and for my birthday, he offered to buy or make an ice cream cake for me. Well, guess what? I'm lactose intolerant. I like ice cream, but I would much prefer a German chocolate cake, right? I like deep, rich, dark chocolate. And so one way of reframing that I think ties into what Jessica was sharing is that thinking about the golden rule and shifting the language a little bit differently, and this ties in both with empathy to a degree, but also perspective taking, is treat others the way they want to be treated, right? Don't assume that they want to be treated the same way as you. And part of that requires that we get to know them, right? That we ask them questions, that we listen deeply, listen actively, to understand to the best of our ability, because we're never going to fully understand where they're coming from, but to the best of our ability where they're coming from, so that we can treat them the way they want to be treated, rather than the way that we want to be treated. So I just like using that like little example, and some people call that the platinum rule, because because platinum historically over like the last century has been slightly more valuable than gold, and so platinum's a little bit higher than gold, right? So I just wanted to highlight that. Thank you, Leo, for making that connection, right? So we're going to talk briefly about de-escalation, and then we're also we're going to skip one slide because of timing, and then we're going to end by talking about assertive skills, and then in the last few minutes of class, we have a couple of examples. We might only get to one, but we can show both of them maybe, that we hopefully will be able to tie some of what we've talked about today into like some real concrete examples that you all probably can relate to a certain extent. So de-escalation is this idea that we're almost de-escalating, bringing down, right? Let's see if my clicker is working.
I need to actually swipe the screen. So.
Oh yeah, I forgot that. Something's acting wonky. 1 second, folks. We have a. There we go. I'm just going to hit this. So de-escalation is the process of calmly communicating with aggravated or agitated individuals so as to bring down the level of tension and provide space for effective communication. If you look on the right-hand side of your screen where the emoji faces are, you have the angry face up top, right? And I have like a couple of steps that are red, and then it goes down to a couple of steps that are yellow, and then a couple of steps that are green. When someone's up in the red area, when they are agitated, angry, frustrated, insert a bunch of different emotions that Jessica was showing us earlier, people don't listen. They're not going to hear you. They're not going to be present with you. On the same end, when we're really frustrated, agitated, angry, we shut down. We can't. It's really hard for us to listen and take in and be present with people. Mindfulness helps us personally like de-escalate, right? Where we can get down into that yellow and green space where we're present and can fully listen and engage. But what about the other party, right? If they're angry and we're having this argument over some contentious issue, or maybe it's just a silly issue, it could be contentious, it could be silly. We can't, if we're yelling back and forth, we're not even listening. Yelling back and forth is not constructive. And so we talk about this notion of de-escalating. Let's see if this is working. I don't know what I'm doing here. This slide is, okay. And I'm just gonna quickly go through a few essential steps for thinking about how to effectively de-escalate a situation when you're in a conversation with someone that is agitated, frustrated, angry. So the first one, and it's not showing up on the screen yet, but it will, is respond versus react. When we react, we're reacting from that reptilian brain with that fight, flight, freeze responses. What Jessica referred to earlier is like, you know, we call it the amygdala hijacking, right? Like where we're not thinking rationally, we're not thinking from our rational mind. And so by being present and mindful, we actually are able to respond in a more rational, less reactionary way. Uh-oh, now something's really going wrong.
The Wi-Fi is just bad on that screen, but I don't think it's affecting anybody else.
Are you all still able to see our presentation?
Yeah, we're actually seeing it before you know that we're seeing it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's just that screen.
Okay, great. And so the second one is remain calm and suspend your judgment, right? And Jessica also referenced suspension of judgment towards self, but also towards others. And so again, mindfulness helps us to remain calm and to suspend our judgment. It's almost impossible to fully suspend our judgment, but instead of like voicing it, verbalizing it, showing it in our body language and our facial expressions, we can hold it in and not project that judgment onto other people. When we do, then they become defensive, and that does not help with the de-escalation. The next one is validate the feelings as opposed to statements or actions. So if you disagree with someone, you don't want to necessarily say, I agree with you, right? That's going to validate their statement or their action. But what you can say is, going back to what was shared previously, you can say, I understand that you're really frustrated, or I understand that you're very passionate about this issue, or I understand that your experience is different than my experience. And by using that language, people recognize that you're listening, that you're present with them, that you're hearing them, and that helps in bringing people down those steps towards that yellow or green space where they're more receptive to listen and engage. The fourth one is give space. Don't rush a conversation. Don't try to force people to de-escalate. It's okay to have some silence or some space in that conversation. Actually, space can help us help our blood pressure go down, help us to become more calm. Instead of just firing off words, right? That can cause people to get defensive and reactionary too. And then the last two is active and reflective listening. We talked a little bit about active listening earlier. Reflective listening is that idea of reflecting back or paraphrasing back what you're hearing. And I really like to focus on, as I just used in the example, emotions. If you're noticing emotions, or if they're using language that is identifying emotions for them, use that same language, right? Or use very similar language, and reflect it back to them. If they're feeling, if they are showing that they're feeling frustrated, you know, I hear you. It sounds like you're really frustrated. You know, can validate that they're being heard and help to de-escalate their anxiety and tension and frustration and anger. And then finally, don't take it personally, right? Oftentimes when we're in conflict, we take it, there's a lot of people that take it personally and they hold on to it, and that is not healthy. When we find ourselves in conflict, especially if it's around an issue that's important to us, it's okay to just let it go, and not spend too much time dwelling on it or taking it personally. Oftentimes when we're in conflict with other people and aggression and anger come out, it's people's own baggage that they're bringing to those expressions. And so just recognizing that, I encourage people not to take things too personally. Most people, and you've probably heard this before, are thinking much more about themselves than they are about anyone else, right? I'm not thinking about Matt all the time and how he hurt me or said something that was rude. And so it's important to not take things personally. Okay, there we go. And I already mentioned this, but it's almost impossible to reason with someone who is really angry or agitated. So reasoning is not the first step. Trying to de-escalate things first is helpful. Okay, I'm going to skip this slide. So I'm going to really quickly end on this. We won't go into too much detail, just for the sake of time, but asking for what I want and what I need when you're in a tense conflict situation. We call this assertion skills, and there is a 3-step model for assertion skills, and I'd be more than willing to share some more resources with folks that are interested. I'll add my email to the chat at the end of the session. But just referring to this slide, too many of us struggle with asserting ourselves, especially in conflict type situations. Instead, people tend to be overly submissive and passive, or overly aggressive and competitive. And assertion falls in between, right? It's where it helps us to find the middle ground and really being able to ask for what we want in a way that does not threaten the other person or individual, where they don't feel the perception that they're being threatened. And that's important, because as soon as we are communicating in a way that causes people, especially in conflict, causes people to feel threatened or to perceive that something, their needs, interests, values, or identity is being threatened, they get defensive, or they get combative, or they get submissive and shut down. So I just wanted to highlight that. And this last section is just an example of these 3-part assertion messages and steps. I'm more than willing to share this with folks if you're interested. We're not going to go into detail about it right now. So Jess, do you want to start us out on the
Well, do we want to see if there's any questions?
Yeah, maybe that's.
I wasn't sure if that was more valuable than going through the examples.
Yeah, I kind of rushed through that. Sorry.
I think we just prepared too much information.
Yeah.
There's so much here.
We need 2.5 hours, not an hour and a half.
I know.
So.
What questions
Yeah.
do you all have? Are these sessions recorded, available to listen to again?
I believe so. Or the first one definitely is. This one, because of the Wi-Fi issues, I don't know. We were recording it, it may have cut out.
Okay, so the recording may have cut out, but we can, is there a way we can share our
Oh, your slides? Yeah.
our slides?
Yeah, Monica, are you still here? Monica Starks?
I don't see Monica anymore.
Okay, yeah, I'll look into that and then
Sure.
we can absolutely find a way to
Yeah.
post the materials online. And I will email it out through all the avenues that all the messaging, did for this workshop as well.
Our email addresses are here too, and you can email either of us or both of us directly. We're happy to share information with you. We can share the presentation too. We're happy to do that.
Want me to jump in?
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Tyler Olson, Jessica McLaughlin. Monica was here earlier. I wanted to acknowledge her as well. She is the chair of the task force that's part of the Stand for Racial Justice, and has been absolutely wonderful in that role. I want to thank the people who were here in person today, all right, as well as everybody else who showed up online. Nick Yoho, who helped set up everything with technology. I also just want to add that I've learned some very important things today. If you want to keep Ty happy, you got to give him cheese, gluten, German chocolate cake, and coffee.
Yes.
I think coffee was number one.
Coffee was definitely number one.
Number one.
All righty. And with that being said, if anybody wants to hang out for a minute after we stop recording, we'll be here for a few more minutes. Otherwise, look forward to the next session. Mondays is entirely on WebEx from 2 to 3:30. That will be with a professor of communications, Derek Williams. It'll be about spin zones and echo chambers. The idea that we often take in information that's already on our own wavelength rather than reading and seeing things that might challenge us and put us out of our comfort zone. And then a week from today, if you can stand this voice right here talking some more, David Reynolds and I will be discussing the use and misuse of history, especially in relation to discussions surrounding racial justice. So I really look forward to that and hope that as many of you as possible can attend. All righty.